last video, I left you off here. We were talking about that energy transfer through food chains. I left you with this, how humans could be, or more humans could be supported if we all were vegetarians. And mainly that's just due to that energy decrease. Going from corn to humans, you have more energy available to you than if we went from corn to cow and then cow to humans. And again, the very last note that I left with you is that shorter food chains can support more individuals than longer ones. Not just with humans, but really in the animal kingdom in general. You very rarely see organisms or food chains that are 10 trophic levels large, just because there's not enough energy to get to that very top trophic level. Most food chains will end somewhere in the 5 to 6 range. So I'm going to give you guys a word problem. This is a typical word problem you could see on the review quiz, you could see on a test, even the lab quiz, because in lab we'll be covering this material as well. So here's the problem. Consider the above food chain. So the food chain is maize or corn, goes to the locust, goes to the lizard, goes to the snake. We could also redraw this so it was a trophic pyramid, but it's the same information. So it says, consider the above food chain. If there are 3,200,000 incoming calories of sunlight, how much will the snake get? So consider that word problem, and given this food chain, I'm going to give you the opportunity to pause this video to work on this problem. So go ahead and pause now. Alright, welcome back. So hopefully you've worked through this problem and you got the right answer. So what I'm going to do, and where most people mess up, let me get my pen here, where most people mess up is that they give this 3 million calories to corn. But that's not what the problem said. The problem said you had 3 million calories of sunlight. So I'm going to draw the sun up here. So we have the sun. It is the sun that has this 3,200,000 calories. Now remember that 10% rule also applies sunlight to those producers. So that means this corn is getting 320,000 calories. If you didn't know, when doing 10%, really easy way to do 10%, you just get rid of that last digit. So this 3,200,000, if I got rid of that last zero, gave me 320,000. So do 10% to the locust, that's going to be 32,000 to the locust. If I go to the lizard, that's going to be 3,200 to the lizard. And then last but not least, our snake is going to have 320 calories. You really need to pay attention to the wording of the questions. Because I could have also said, consider the above food chain. If there are 3,200,000 calories in locusts, that would tell me, let me do a different color. So let's put this in blue. So let's imagine that this problem said, instead of sunlight, I said we had that many calories in locusts. And then I said, how much is in corn? I'm like, well, whoa, what do you mean what's in corn? So now you have to work backwards. So let me put it this way. So locusts, we have 3, 200, 100. Well, we know maize must have more than that because locust only had 10%. So maize has even more than that. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to add a zero back to that. So I'm going to say maize has 32 million. So here I'm just giving you different possibilities of how you would see an energy transfer problem. Really, it's just reading the question carefully to figure out what calories that I give you, who has those calories. Once you determine who has those calories, doing the calculations are fairly easy. I can also show you a food chain like this and say, oh, what is the lizard? Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, etc. So all sorts of questions I could ask you about a food chain or a trophic pyramid. Alright, so here's another food chain. Here's an actual aquatic food chain. Remember, although yes, we see land food chains all the time, there's a whole other world of the ocean, of ponds, of riverine ecosystems. So they too have food chains, but they look a little bit different than ours in the sense of the organisms that are part of those food chains. So here, again, we have an aquatic food chain, but take a look at this. It's just like our other food chains, but if I said, what's happening in an ecosystem? And I was like, oh, here's a food chain. That's not really the whole picture, right? I mean, sure, small sharks might eat this ocean sunfish, but do you think that's the only thing they eat? Do you think they eat other things? Large sharks, do you think they eat more than just small sharks? Food chains, no matter if they're in the water or on land, isolate a single feeding pattern. But the thing is, in real life, most species are what we call generalist species. As the name suggests, they eat a lot of things. They generally eat things, versus, say, a specialist, where you eat just one thing. Most species, like humans, are generalists. We eat all sorts of things. You don't know anyone who only eats mozzarella sticks. Everyone eats a wide variety of different organisms, plants, and animals. Same with most other species. They are also generalists. So a way we can better display those relationships, those feeding relationships between predator and prey, between consumers and producers, is through a food web. So here's a food web that has some of the same organisms. Here we have our large sharks. Well, you can see large sharks, yeah, they eat small sharks, but they also eat tuna, and they also eat marlin. Those small sharks are eating tuna and squid and sunfish and lancet fish. And you also notice they're kind of eating at different levels too. They're not just eating the next organism down. They might be eating a couple organisms down. And that's totally okay. Humans do the same thing. We eat vegetables, we eat producers, but we also eat consumers. Totally okay. Organisms can occupy the same or multiple trophic levels. And food webs are a really great way, or a better way, to kind of explain what's happening in an ecosystem. So, if you have your human biology and condensed book, there's a word problem in there using this food web. The food web itself is on page 1-10. The questions that accompany this food web are on the previous page, on page 1-9. For those of you who do not have that book, you can open up the actual PowerPoint file that goes along with this video, and then open up this food web, and then on the next slide, these are all the questions that go with that food web. I highly recommend, if you don't have the book, to maybe sketch this in your notebook, or to do this on the computer and record your answers. Now, one question that is not on the food web, and you should always start this when you're doing a food web, is denote who everyone is. Are they a producer? Are they a consumer? What type of consumer? Are they a primary consumer or secondary consumer? That's actually where I'm going to start, you guys, before I let you pause and answer some of those questions. So like I said, anytime you see a food web, go ahead and label what each individual organism is. The main reason for that is I will ask you, what is this organism? What is this organism? The questions on here will say, oh, who's a primary consumer? Well, if you've already labeled them all, very easy to answer that question. So here's where you start. I always start from the bottom and work my way up. Now there's some new words in here. As if you're not familiar with the marine ecosystem, a lot of this won't seem familiar. For example, here I have cyanobacteria. Now it does tell you it's a phytoplankton, but maybe you also forgot what phytoplankton were. Take a look at what it's eating. Well, if you look, it's not eating anything. So that tells you it must be a producer. So even if you don't know what the producer is, if it's not eating anything, that's a dead giveaway. It must be a producer. So I'm going to go ahead and put a P next to this. I also see here we have diatoms. Not all of these have pictures. Here we have diatoms. It's also phytoplankton, and again, it's not eating anything else. So I'm going to put a P next to that one. And then finally over here, submerged aquatic vegetation. It looks like grass blades, that's essentially what it is. Also a producer. So I'm going to put a P next to that one. Now I'm going to do a couple more of these before I pause and let you take over. So then I just work my way up. So I'm going to look at copepods. Copepods eat two different things. They're eating diatoms, so they're eating a producer. The other thing they eat is also a producer. So it's eating two producers, which is kind of straightforward. So that makes these copepods primary consumers. They are the first consumer in that food chain. So they are the primary consumer. All right, let's take a look at, minnows. Minnows, let me make this 1, 0, so you know that's primary, not a producer. Minnows also eat this producer. They eat this producer. That must make them a primary consumer. Now let's look at a trickier one. Let's look at these snails, these guys right here. So they eat this vegetation, that's a producer. They eat these diatoms, that's a producer. So right now, I can go ahead and say it's eating producers. It must be primary consumer. But take a look at what else it eats. This other arrow leads to copepods. Copepods are a primary consumer. Well, if snails are eating a primary consumer, it must be a secondary consumer. So in this case, snails are serving two roles. They are a primary consumer in some food chains. So if you go to vegetation and then to snails, it's a primary consumer. But if we go from diatoms to copepods to snails, then it's serving as a secondary consumer. And so your goal when looking at these organisms, for example, trout, well, we have copepods, that's one arrow, and minnows, that's one arrow. We can figure out what trout are. So continue with this, work your all the way up until you have this entire thing labeled. Once you have it labeled, go ahead and restart this video and we'll go over those. So go ahead and pause now. Alright, so hopefully you've put all of your labels in. And I'm going to go ahead and keep going, and I'm going to start with trout. So for trout, they eat the primary consumer copepods. They also eat the primary consumer minnows. So that makes them a secondary consumer. Let's go to bluegill sunfish. They're just eating the primary copepods. That makes them secondary. Largemouth bass are eating secondary. They're eating this secondary. That makes them tertiary. Osprey are eating a tertiary, so that makes them a quaternary. They're also eating this secondary, so that makes them a tertiary. All I'm doing is just adding 1 to anything that they eat. We have this crayfish over here. Now here's a kind of tricky one. Crayfish eat something that's primary and secondary. So crayfish, I'm going to add 1 to both of those. In some food chains, crayfish is a secondary, and in some food chains, crayfish is a tertiary. Now the great blue heron, last but not least, they eat the secondary sunfish, so that makes them tertiary. They eat the secondary trout, so still tertiary. And they eat the crayfish, which is sometimes secondary, which would make it tertiary, and sometimes tertiary, which makes this great blue heron quaternary. Now that we have everything labeled correctly, you can go ahead and work on the questions. Now that once you've finished working on those questions, start the next video and we'll go over the answers, which is where this lecture will finish.